I want to say that this series was very popular. We actually exceeded the number of people who signed up. We have 500 and had a wait list. So I'm guessing we're going to see the number tick up as we get going. But I'm going to start with some housekeeping and introductions. For those of you who don't know, my name is Cheryl Kubiak, and I am the Dean of the School of Social Work at Wayne State. And I'm so happy to be here today and so happy to bring this presentation to you. I think that the times that we are in right now are completely demanding and sometimes depleting of our energy. They're mentally grueling and sometimes we get very tired. But I see social advocacy and social activism as a remedy for some of those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that we have. Because activism happens in community. It happens with others. It can decrease our sense of isolation and increase our sense of hope. So this panel today, I'm hoping that will bring you hope, that will bring you a sense of how to form community and new communities, and to be, all of us, involved in the way we want to see this country moving forward. We want to see social work moving forward. So I'm very, very pleased to bring this panel today. Before I talk a little bit about the panel, I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping things. As Betsy said, there are sign-up links for CE credits, as well as students who are looking for extra credits because they're attending for class. There's links in the chat. They're cycling those links throughout, so that will be helpful. I also want to say that we do have signing available ASL for those who may need it, and interpretation into Spanish and other languages will be available in the YouTube version. We are recording this, and the YouTube versions will be available so that people can interpret or use the language function to put it into Spanish or Arabic or whatever language that they may need to hear this from. We're going to have questions and answers that you can type in to the chat box. Chantalia Johns will be looking at those, and we'll bring those up in our question and answer period. But our three panelists today are three activists well known in this Detroit community. And I want to just say, I'm not going to talk about who they are because we'll introduce them later, but Teddy Dorsett, Tawana Petty, and Dr. Abdul Saeed will be with us today. Our moderator for this session is Shay Howell, who is an activist in her own right. She has lived in Detroit for over 50 years and is co-founder of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center. She's a member of the advisory board for Allied Media Conference, and she is currently engaged in efforts to secure as a human right and to create a liberated areas based on urban agriculture and local production. Shay works in a coalition supporting abolition, new forms of education, and enriching democratic practices. She is also a co-editor of the Riverwise magazine. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's available online, and I encourage you to go to search for it and click it because you will find information about emerging and alternative ways of life in the city. Shay Howell is also a professor of communication at Oakland University, and I want to express my gratitude for her taking time to lead this panel today. Shay?
Thank you, Dean. And I'm also a proud alum of Wayne State. So thank you. And it's wonderful to see all you. And as far as a source of hope today, seeing how many people are here to talk about social action is a source of hope, I think, for all of us. And as the Dean said, we have a wonderful panel. I am not going to give you an intense biography, because part of my responsibility is to provide a context for you to come to know these activists in their own words and their own right. But we are going to give just a sentence for each one. The process will be each of the panelists will speak for about 10, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of interaction among the panelists, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions via the chat. So as questions occur to you, put them in the chat so that we're able to filter those through and we can get to as many of those as we can. So we're going to start right away with our very first panelist, Teddy Dorsett. Teddy is a member of the deaf community. He is an activist, a filmmaker, an entrepreneur, and a person who is creating institutions to promote deaf culture and disability culture. So Teddy, I'm going to turn to you and welcome you. And my first question to you, which will be the first question to everyone, can you tell us a little bit about how you became active in social justice work? What moved you to begin to do that kind of work in your life?
Hi, thank you, thank you. I feel privileged to be here and to share my story and my experiences and to give some things that you can take away from today. That's really exciting. So briefly about myself, I was born and raised here in Detroit. I'm 6th generation deaf in my family. And I've always told people that I was born an activist. I was born an activist and I didn't have a choice. There was always a challenge, but really I have to give credit to my parents who provided me with an example of what it meant to be an advocate for those who are fighting for me and for my brothers and sisters. And I, being 6th generation in my family who is deaf, that includes my mom, my sister, my brother, and it's been ongoing. I've advocated for myself and a lot of things in my life. Getting more access to communication, access to information, and in school, sports, and socializing, and life with family, friends. And, you know, just throughout my education, from kindergarten up through 12th and through college, I've been very active in setting up my own clubs, setting up a variety of clubs, and setting up things like my own nonprofit organization, taking a role in a multitude of organizations. For example, here I am involved with the Detroit Black Deaf Advocates. At the national level, I am involved with the National Association for the Deaf and also here on the governing selection board for the last few years. And I am still serving on the governing statewide independent living committee, and I've been working for the Detroit nonprofit organization, peer nonprofit organization, as a communication moderator. My background in regards to communication, I am a filmmaker. That's my passion. And the reason being that I wanted to become, you know, I wanted to provide jobs, and I've always seen on TV and films that there were not enough people of color or disabled people represented in entertainment and in also the entertainment industry. So that's really my passion. I want to change that and to take leadership in developing stories and the creativeness for disability for people like myself. I've created, directed, acted in a variety of movie projects and documentaries, both personal and professional as well. And there's a lot of Detroit deaf people that face double discrimination. And what that double discrimination means is that we are discriminated against because we are Black. We are also discriminated against because we're deaf. And so both the racism and autism, along with ableism, that has been going on for many years. And in terms of barriers to communication, for health services, for employment, for education, and a variety of things. As a filmmaker, I've worked with a lot of different organizations to make sure that I can make that content 100% accessible in a voice forum, and also to be able to put in deaf ASL experts and not put in a hearing person and then later on asking to have somebody interpret that into ASL. And so doing that right off. I have been blessed to have great mentors like myself who are Black and deaf, who have helped me to lead the way and to make sure that our community has access to opportunities that we haven't gotten for so many years. My desire and my hope is to pay it forward by using my professional skills and my personal experiences that I have gone through, that I can support our Black deaf activists, be involved with different organizations, and that particular fight against bias that we face in our community. My recent project that I have been working on in regards to film is called # Black Deaf Skill, and I will show that next week, Monday, as part of the Ford Foundation, creating art projects. So hopefully to expose and to describe why it's so important to advocate, to find the funding for Black deaf people to show their creative skills. There's a few important issues that I have seen that are facing our Black deaf community in Detroit. Right now, during this political area, I have seen, with BLM and with COVID, the impacts it has hit many of us in Detroit in terms of struggling getting basic access to healthcare. We're not a priority in many policy decisions that are made by our community government. And we should have ASL, captioning, communication access to many different things. How we work right now in terms of changing that, just recently with my own work involved with Detroit Disability Power, DDP, we've set up a focus group for people with disabilities, and we get together and we discuss, and we've met with the mayor and proposed to the mayor's office and the Detroit Detroit City Revision, and they really support. The Detroit City Council has been very supportive and supporting and setting up the Office of Disability Affairs. And right now, that has gone to the mayor for them to make decisions in terms of if we can go ahead and set up the new office, or if they would rather have it be separate. I want to set up an office that would be a champion, that would fight for people with disabilities, with the same concept in what we've already seen in other cities. For example, in New York City, they already have an office for people with disabilities. In Chicago, has just recently set up an office for people with disabilities as well. So why don't we here in Detroit have that? And that's what I would like to do. Our next step, and I'm waiting to see as to where the city council, the CHAR committee, they're going to decide with a budget and whether or not they're going to support our proposal. Another challenge that has really impacted a lot of people with disabilities currently, I was thinking about an article that I recently read about by a disability activist by the name of Ali Wong. She wrote an article, and she wrote an article that was really very impactful as to what she said. And the inaccessibility is also a form of voter oppression. With the Disabilities Act, which just became 30 years old in July, and with the help of the American Voters Act that was passed in 2002, but access to voting is still a huge issue, even more so now during the pandemic. And our president is still rejecting our voting rights. There are a lot of different states and websites and election polls that are not accessible. And it becomes very difficult for voters to request for a ballot that is accessible for them. For example, a Braille ballot or large print, they're still not accessible. And also our biggest challenge is we still don't prioritize in all communities, locations, the policy decision making. A couple of ways that we can do that now in terms of making a difference in promoting social justice here in Detroit. Join us. Detroit Disability Power has already set up a variety of programs, including a campaign to help make sure that our people with disabilities are aware and have access to information and how they can vote, where they can vote, and also exposure to different issues that we people with disabilities face to make sure that people don't make decisions and not be aware of what's going on. You can go to our website to learn more about what we do and get involved in the discussion. Make sure that when you get involved in different organizations or any important decision making, make sure that you speak up and let those different important people know to prioritize those with disabilities, especially with housing, employment, transportation. That's just the beginning of the list. And in the end, I do want to say that all people with disabilities should go and vote, because that's one of the best ways that we can make a difference and change the system, those system barriers here in the United States. Disability vote is power. And that's where our power is, when we vote.
Thank you so much, Teddy. Can you remind people or put in the chat when your film will be shown? But you know what, as you were talking, what I was wondering was, what would be the most important thing for people who are hearing to do now to be an ally?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I missed the interpreter signing.
Surely. Could you tell us what would be now the most important thing for an ally to do? What would be the kind of action we could take to be most supportive of your community?
As I just mentioned, really getting involved with different organizations that advocate for people with disabilities, because we do work and we are pushing, and we're pushing our local government to make sure that they prioritize people with disabilities. And I know some of us work for different nonprofit organizations, or currently we're working where we can make a difference to make sure that people with disabilities are prioritized.
And what about in the city? I know we're working now to get the Office of Disability. Are there stumbling blocks that we should be thinking about? Is it just a question of budget, or are there people who are not sensitive to the whole issue?
I missed the first part. If you could repeat.
What are the stumbling blocks to getting the Office of Disability okayed in the city?
One of the stumbling blocks we're facing right now is making the city council to approve the proposal. The city government, their challenge is supporting that proposal with a budget of almost $3 million. So the city of Detroit is a little resistant in terms of supporting that money to sit up a full office that represents people with disabilities. It was just released that there was a job opening for an assistant director for accessibility, I believe it was. And that one position is out of the 12 positions that we asked for in our proposal. And another issue that we're facing is the city notified us that they do not have enough data to prove, to verify that we are in the disability community. They're not satisfied with their accessibility that they're providing to us. So what we need to do is to file complaints, to send that information and let the city know that we're not satisfied with the accessibility issues that are going on in our community. We need to take responsibility in pushing for that.
I also am looking at all of the people who are here, and I'm thinking some of them must be doing research to help you document what are the primary stumbling blocks for people with disabilities. When you think about the areas of life that are covered by particularly people in social work, things like housing, transportation, jobs, if you could direct some research in one of those areas, where might it be?
That's a good question, because there's not enough information or data that helps us to see where those areas are that we need help in. The number one issue that we have is we don't have enough data to support us. And now that's one of the things that we need to work on, is to building that data currently. Our census does not reflect any information of people with disabilities. So we are missing that kind of data to get the right funding and support that we need. I would really encourage those of you to think about how you can support different ways to get that, where many of us face challenges in For those of us who in the Black deaf community, we struggle in getting mental health access because of there's a lack of representation and a lack of people who have the skill and the ability to communicate with us. That's one example of additional support that we do need. We need to start developing more individuals who can do work to support our community.
I really appreciate the need for data and the need to develop a larger understanding for people who can work in the community. I wonder about young people in the school systems right now that people are really not in classrooms. And do you know anything about what sort of supports are going on for young children with disabilities?
Really, normally here in Detroit, there's a lot of Black people who live here who are facing so many challenges, financial, and it is hard for any parent to make sure that their children have access to the internet, they have access to equipment, laptops, those kinds of things in which they can facilitate and proceed with schooling. When you think about adding a disability or a disability barrier, for example, interpreter access, or a student who may be deaf-blind and what they're kind of access with, and students who may have different types of mental challenges, it becomes more challenging. And in terms of trying to do work on the laptop or on the computer, due to, instead of doing it in person, we are a visual people and we depend on contact and touch. And it becomes a challenge for deaf-blind, and many parents are really struggling to get access for their children. It's really a big problem because there is a lack of technology and there's not enough support and resources to support teachers that are able to do the work and to support different social workers that are able to support the teachers and the parents, especially doing this from home. It becomes more of a challenge.
I think that you've given us a lot of things to think about that need to change, and that social workers would be in a unique position to actually create that change. So I'm very, very glad to have this opportunity to talk.
If I may, if I can add one more thing. Social workers play a huge part of our lives. As young adults growing up, being in school and the educational system, it's a huge role in regards to our mental health and our education that is needed, because social workers are our line of defense, because they can advocate for us as well for things that we need. And I am really appreciative of the social workers and the counselors that I had growing up, because they've also played a huge part in my life, and they still do today.
Can I ask you a question about your filmmaking?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. I'm wondering, is there a film you would love to make that is kind of out there in your thinking? The fantasy film?
Oh, my biggest passion is to make more documentaries because they're true stories and we're able to connect, and it can show a representation of people with disabilities and to share more of our stories and our experiences and what we have gone through. You might not often see something like that or get something from a different perspective. And for me, the creativity, something that I really want to do is to produce a full feature film. That's my next project next year that I'm working on, 2 full feature films for next year. Just letting you know.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. And I want to remind people about your showing that's coming up this week, to please put that in the chat again so people, can come and see it at Wayne State. And can you give us just a hint what it's about?
My film is really just a brief video explaining the importance of why we should support people with disabilities in creative arts and what challenges we face and what we need. I did interviews with Black deaf artists who have amazing skills, and they shared their experiences as an artist, as a dancer, and explained what kinds of support that we need. And basically, as I spoke earlier, is to be more thoughtful and forward thinking and making sure to prioritize people with disabilities and people of color, because there's not enough representation and we need more of that. So if people who are involved in films and entertainment, go ahead and think about us as well. Open doors, open opportunities, develop funding for us. And that's pretty much my message. How can we develop more talent, more creative artists? We just have to build them by putting in the work and developing more opportunities. For example, my nonprofit organization that I work with youth in providing them opportunities to continue their passion in creative arts and giving workshops and giving scholarships and providing training. We've hosted a camp. It's really inspired by seeing so many young children who are excited and know that they can continue to be creative and the opportunities are there.
Well, thank you so much, Teddy. We'll get back to you and talk with you a bit more, and you might want to think about what questions you have for some of our other panelists as well, because certainly our next panelist is also an artist. She always bills herself first as a mother, but I think many of us know Tawana Petty as Honeycomb, or we know her as a poet as well as an activist. And Tawana has been a major person in helping us understand the whole idea of digital justice in our city. So I want to turn our spotlight to Tawana and welcome her and ask her the very same question I asked you, Teddy, which is, Tawana, can you tell us something about what have been the things that moved you to activism?
Hi, Shay. It's always good to see you.
It's really
one of my favorite humans. Thank you so much. You know, I can give a lot of credit to, and I know you'll ask me this later, but really I was going about my business writing poems, which I thought, you know, the poems were pretty much visionary and contributing to social justice narratives. But it was when I was introduced to the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center about 12 years ago that I really got serious about social justice. And so I went from basically performing about the ills of the world to praxis. And so I have been intricately involved in doing a lot of social justice organizing around water rights advocacy, around digital and data privacy, um, around really just contributing to many of the issues that plague our society, Detroit most prominently. And so the main focuses of my work until the last maybe 6 years have been solely around countering the dominant negative narrative of Detroit, you know, having experienced what it feels like to grow up in a city where the whole world has this dominant pervasive narrative about who you are as a human being, and seeing the impact psychologically that that has on young people, you know, adults and elders in the community. I wanted to use my poetry and my art and activism to counter that and create alternatives. And so organizing conferences, social justice events, workshops, and things like that. That's how I mostly contribute.
You know, it's what I'm struck by, both you and Teddy talking about the negative views of people and how that's embedded in the dominant narrative. And I know you've thought a lot about this. Why is that the dominant narrative? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely, I think Teddy touched on this a bit too, is the city is predominantly Black. And so it's been really easy to kind of paint this broad brush over the city and not dig deep enough about the systemic issues and impacts to our quality of life here. And so responses to quality of life issues, which are a direct result of poverty and disinvestment and abandonment, the responses that we get are heavy-handed militarization over policing, surveillance, and more dominant negative narrative. And so, you know, it's been really a bit traumatizing, really, to grow up. I'm 44 years old, and to have my entire life be under that kind of umbrella of what Detroiters uh, uh, the narrative that Detroiters are not contributing human beings, and that we're kind of hopeless, helpless, bankrupt, not worthy of affordable water, not worthy of affordable housing, not worthy of affordable of adequate recreation, grocery stores in our neighborhoods. And so it's been very violent, right? And I'll just finally say, you know, COVID-19 really taught me a deep lesson about the ways in which we're responded to or not responded to. You know, 1,500 Detroiters died of COVID-19. Nearly 40% of the state at one point, deaths came just out of Detroit. And prior to COVID-19, the median income here was $29,000 a year. And since COVID-19, 40% of the residents have lost their jobs. And so instead of the responses being empathetic and there being more and more investment in the community, we've been struck by mass surveillance and militarized policing and greater criminalization. And at one point, they issued almost 2,800 $1,000 tickets to residents in Detroit as we were dying so rapidly to COVID-19, for not social distancing at a time where you could see people in predominantly white communities all over the country at beaches and protesting, storming on the Capitol building and protesting the orders. And so, yeah, the drastic disparities in the narratives just really ramped up during a time where we really should have been receiving empathy from the entire country.
You know, you give us a lot to think about in that, and about what's happening around the characterization of Detroit. I wonder, to just take a step back a minute,
Yeah.
and ask, why do you think Detroit represents not only this negative, but this idea of visionary organizing? What does that mean, and how do we think about that in the juxtaposition here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, our elders, yourself included, have always talked about the making a way out of no way, right? We've kind of had to figure out how to turn to one another, how to look out for one another, how to ensure that if your neighbor didn't have water, that you offered water. If there wasn't a grocery store within walking distance, that you made sure the elder in your neighborhood got groceries. If there wasn't adequate housing with heat, that you made sure that your neighbors didn't freeze. And so there's just always kind of been this turning to one another in the community that doesn't get lifted up in the narrative. I mean, I grew up in poverty in the city, and I can remember, everybody on my street ate. If there was probably one or two houses that made sure that all the kids ate in the neighborhood. And so, there was just always this visionary resistance to what felt like abandonment from like the power structures. And so I just think, and then we have a long legacy of activism. Of course, James and Grace Lee Boggs, yourself, and other social justice warriors for the last half century or more, who have been constantly paying forward that knowledge, and that kind of alternative vision that we need to tap into, telling us that revolution, is evolution into what it means to be a more contributing, more transformative human being. And so I've always, at least over the last 12 years of my life, I've been able to apply political understanding to what I was experiencing in a community when community members were looking out for one another.
In terms of visionary organizing, one of the places where I think one of the many places where you have been really pushing new thinking is around this question of being an anti-racist. And I wonder if you could help us think about what's pushed you and what you think are critical changes that we need to have as we think about anti-racism now, especially in this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Shay. For the first time in my life, the entire world is standing up in defense of Black lives for the first time in my lifetime. And I feel like I was starting to deepen my questions, like prior to this moment, and thinking about what it meant to move beyond solidarity, beyond allyship, even beyond being like accomplices to collective liberation, to co-liberation, like what it meant to have all of us see that our liberation is tied up in one another's, and what the impact of the system of white supremacy not only has on Black people and people of color, but on white people, and how it dehumanizes us to such a way that we aren't able to turn to one another, that we are struggling for a kind of position within a quote unquote privileged society that really dehumanizes us all. And a lot of us die out trying to pursue the quote unquote American dream. Like many of us never really attain this kind of false narrative of hierarchy that we're supposed to be in pursuit of. And so my challenge is to have us digging deeper into how these systems have kind of shredded our humanity and prevented us from making sure that we all have some dignity and self-respect. And so I do a lot of anti-racism workshops, and talking about like who are the ancestors, especially when I do workshops with white people, who are the ancestors you can tap into that are not tied to a legacy of violence, and lynching and slavery, because they exist. And then how can we tap into a level of humanity that calls on us to be that person? If you can't look yourself in the mirror and see yourself tied to a legacy of undoing racism, of abolition, of humane systems, then it's really hard to not see it as something other than an opt-in and opt-out type of work. And so, yeah, pushing forward empathy, slowing down the kind of anti-racism seesaw that a lot of us have been on, where we opt in and opt out, and really just giving us an opportunity to see each other as fully human.
I know so much of your work is around anti-racism, but I also know a lot of your work has been around this question of police surveillance. And I wonder if you could talk for just a moment about the digital world and how that's influencing Detroiters in particular.
Yes. So, our main work is to push back between the conflation between surveillance and safety. We're in a city right now that has a program called Project Greenlight, and it's a real-time mass surveillance program that has currently under 700 businesses are under this program with over 2,800 surveillance cameras, and that doesn't include traffic lights. That doesn't include officers' access to mobile devices with surveillance technologies, as well as facial recognition technology. And so these are not the things that make us safe. We know the things that make us safe. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see what a safe neighborhood looks like. We know resourced neighborhoods create safety. We know neighborhoods where communities know each other, where there are viable grocery stores, adequate schools, affordable water, and those sorts of things where community members feel like they have someone to turn to. Those are safe neighborhoods. And the conflation between surveillance and safety has really just created a dangerous situation, and added to the mistrust between community members and law enforcement. And so we're doing a lot of work to try to get Project Greenlight and facial recognition out of our communities, and to have one another go back to those things that I mentioned that create safety. And finally, I'll say it has been proven in many, many studies that face recognition misidentifies darker skin tones, sometimes up to 96%. Detroit is a predominantly Black city, and we have law enforcement using a technology that has already misidentified two Black men and potentially a Black woman. And these are just the cases that we know of. So far, 13 cities have banned face recognition, and they are all predominantly white. And these are some of my comrades all across the US, and they're trying to get Detroit to see that this is dangerous, whether you fix the algorithm so that it properly identifies or not. It's a violation of our civil liberties and our privacy. And we're now living in a panopticon where there's nowhere for us to hide. And that isn't safe for the psychological impact of anyone, particularly children, but even adults. And so we really hope that folks will get behind getting this technology out of our city, and to divert those funds into programs that really do create safety. And I'll finally say the Detroiters Bill of Rights is a perfect example. I know Teddy and the disability rights folks are a part of that, as well as yourself, Shay, where we're trying to get the city charter to amend the Constitution to create those measures of safety that create safety for disability communities, for all gendered communities, for all of us, and so that we can have a humane existence within the city of Detroit. And I've dropped a link in there for individual and organizational sign-on.
That's for the Detroit Bill of Rights, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And I wonder, what are the things that would be most helpful in terms of getting particularly Bill of Rights? What would be the most helpful things people do now to support that work?
Contact the city charter. Let the commissioners know that you support the Detroiters Bill of Rights, that you want to see an equitable, just society for all of Detroit's residents, and that you want Detroit to become a model for equity. We have an opportunity to do that. In many ways, Detroit is 50 years ahead of many places. And that isn't the narrative that's lifted up. We have learned how to turn to one another when even the most disinvestment has happened to us. The most drastic levels of abandonment have happened to us. And so I think that we can tap back into that notion of turning to one another, the village mentality that has kept Detroit together for all these decades, and we can become a model for equity. And so I think that that folks should contact the charter and tell them that you're in full support and you want to see this pass through to the ballot.
Right. The other thing we haven't really touched on very deeply is this whole question of water as a human right. And can you just kind of help us think about how that fits in with both the charter effort and the state of the city right now, especially during COVID?
Yeah. So the water as a human right is one of the rights that we have as part of the Detroiters Bill of Rights. And there's a very long legacy of Detroiters advocating for water affordability with the People's Water Board, We the People of Detroit, and so many other organizations. And Detroit modeled a water affordability plan back in 2005. And it has been picked up by other cities and implemented. And it really is saying that if people pay what they can afford, they tend to pay. And so it is better to have more people contributing to the water infrastructure than it is to have people just opt out because they just can't afford it. And it's not going to keep their water on if you pay what you can pay. And unfortunately, at the height of the pandemic, we had to fight to get water back on at a time when all across the world, they were saying one of the main things you need to do is to wash your hands, is to have your hygiene clean. And Detroiters, we still had tens of thousands of people without water on at the height of the pandemic, which explains why we had such a high death rate at that time. And so it really is to the benefit of all of us that we advocate for affordable water. No, there's no magic bubble to protect anyone from someone who's carrying disease because they can't clean themselves. And so the mentality that, oh, if they should just pay their bills, then they would be fine. That's not the case for many people. As I stated, the median income in Detroit prior to COVID-19 was only $29,000 a year. This is predominantly Black women-led households. And since COVID-19, almost 40% of the residents have lost their jobs. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. And those of us who are in a position to advocate for those folks who can not afford water, who are barely hanging on, should do so.
What you're raising now around this whole question of public health is who our next speaker really is. And a person who spent a lifetime thinking about public health. And I know he was on a tight schedule. Has Dr. Abdul, is he here? Can someone tell me if he's joined us yet? Maybe not.
I don't see him, Shay. He was
Okay.
already at 5.
Shay, I'm happy to do a poem.
I was about to say, if you wanted to do a poem, that would be terrific, because I think one of the things I'd like us to talk about when we have our conversations a bit more among you is the role art plays in your lives.
Yeah.
Because both you and Teddy have talked about this creative impulse. And if you wouldn't mind sharing a poem with us, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. We were supposed to turn our backs on you. Count down to your imminent demise, dangle you by the limbs of misdeeds. They wanted us to rate you inferior. Plagued by deteriorating neighborhoods and a convoluted history, you were never supposed to bloom from your ashes. A lot like you have been discarded like debris, deemed useless to naysayers and convictors. Yet you keep rising, clinging to vitality. You refuse to allow statistics to dictate your destiny, and the media will channel your journey. And though some shall remain loyal, others will mock your tribulations. You were combing a young into maturity, both your gift and your curse. Imported from adversity, you've seen better decades, yet you thrive during the worst of them. Your best days have yet to arrive, and though some won't stick around to witness your climb or rejoice in your restoration, your destination is inevitable. You've been on the bottom much longer than most, and the bridges you'll journey won't be easy to coast, but you will make it. And bring warriors with you, armed with devotion. They will defend your dignity and honor your namesake. You are Detroit, the road to progression, the mirror image of endurance. And you hold the key to taking back our democracy.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tawana. I can see the chat. I don't know if you can, but people are saying you're giving them chills. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You know, I wonder about who have been, and I'll ask this to Teddy as well, who have been the artists' work that have inspired you most? Who do you draw on as an artist image when you think about your own art? And Teddy, I wonder if you, who do you think of? Who hasn't been your inspiration? Is Teddy answering? I can't see him.
I'm looking through and I don't see him on the call.
Okay.
Okay.
He just popped up.
Okay. Well, so Tawana, I want to ask you, who is your inspiration?
I see Teddy on the call, FYI. Maybe we could type Teddy a message. But use my artistically.
Yeah, artistic.
I would say that I am I'm a big fan of like Nikki Giovanni. I'm a big fan. Langston Hughes was actually the first poet I ever performed when I was like 6 years old. So Langston Hughes has a special place in my heart. Yeah, and you know, there's so many, there really are so many, but I would say poetically, since Langston was my first, he's just kind of remained close to my heart.
Because I think other people might want to know resources that are beyond, you know, looking at the problems, but how we've seen other people talk about vision and art. And
Riverwise magazine for sure.
Riverwise magazine for sure. Shameless plug, but one is part of the editorial staff. You know, the other part of your biography that we sort of quickly jumped over was the word you usually start with, which is mother.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think both, I was struck when Teddy was speaking about how important his family was to him in gaining a sense of self. And I know how important your family is to you. And I'm thinking about what it means to think about families and how much social work is supportive of that, hopefully at its best.
Yeah.
So are there things, speaking in your mother activist voice, that you could say to social workers that, or a family voice that you think would be helpful to them as they look at their own education and their own lives?
Yes, absolutely. One of the biggest lessons that I learned being a parent, which I think applies to social work, is that young people are full human beings from the minute they are born, and they have full opinions and full experiences, and we don't wait until they become grown to value those. And so my son has been my greatest educator. I've learned so much from him. He is not a say as I do, say as I do as I say, not as I do young person. He's been a debater, I think, even before he joined debate team in high school. But it really has been a tremendous lesson to just really value the ways he experienced the world from the beginning, because we don't know everything, even if we're grown. And I think that is a lesson that needs to be taken into all of our work, is that when you enter a space, you should always enter that space with the mindset that you're going to learn something new, or you have the potential to learn something new. And I'll lift up Grace here, Grace Lee Boggs here, with the, do not get stuck in old ideas. If your ideas are stuck, they are already dead. And I think young people really do give us an opportunity to learn quite constantly that our ideas need to be a little bit flexible. And so, yeah, so I would say that if you just take that mentality into social work, that there's an opportunity to learn something new with each interaction, that it will make you just more humane.
Yeah. I was watching Teddy co-signing you and wondering if he wants to add anything about the role of not so much. So maybe,
That was all good.
Pardon?
That was all good. It was, Tawana, it was beautiful as to what she said. I just wanted to say, wow, it's hard to pick one person. It's so difficult. My life, my family, my deaf siblings. I have friends that, have been, is so supportive like you. And, that's my inspiration to push and to keep going and to keep fighting. So really, those of you who are here today, you are my inspiration. I couldn't just pick one person.
Well, thank you. I see such vibrancy from both of you, and what comes to me is this notion of invisibility, and how our city has been invisible in some ways. But I am also thinking, particularly during this COVID crisis, people were actually talking about letting folks with disabilities die, saying that if you had to choose ventilators, you wouldn't give them to people with disabilities, you would give them to other people. And certainly the refusal to help cities and the threat that cities would not be helped. And it raises, I think, for all of us, the question of the critical nature of public health and having voices that will speak from a different value system than one of destruction and scarcity. And so Dr. Abdul Saeed is with us now, and I want to give him a chance to join us on the call. His work certainly has been in the forefront of redefining public health at its best. And so I want to welcome him and ask him to, like the other two speakers, begin with giving us some sense of his own journey from a person who could have just been an any old doctor to one who chose to take a stand for public health and public policy. So welcome, Dr. Abdul, if you would give us some idea of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you all, and honored to be engaged in this conversation with some incredible folks. Really want to say how grateful I am to folks like Tawana and so many of the others, and to you, Shay, for inviting me. I really appreciated the final question that you asked about activism through one's positionality as a mother. Obviously, I've never been a mother, but I have been privileged to be the product of an incredible grandmother in particular. And she really is the reason why I both sought a career in medicine and then ultimately sought a career in public health. My grandmother, my Teta Soad, was the wisest, most intelligent person I've ever met. And she never got to go to school. She was never associated with any institution. She was the fifth of nine who was growing up in Egypt in the 1930s and 40s. And I would spend a lot of my summers out in Alexandria, leaving my suburban Detroit home to go to the working class community where my father grew up. And in those 15 hours, I would travel 10 years difference in life expectancy. And I'd spend most of my time with my grandmother, and then also with my aunts and uncles, my cousins. My grandmother, she would take particular care to put me in my place. She would point to one of my cousins and say, that one's smarter than you. Point to another one and say, that one's taller and better looking than you. Point to a third and say, that one's kinder and gentler and nicer than you are. Point to a fourth and say, that one's more athletic than you. To the point where I wondered, like, if I had any value at all. And, you know, she would remind me that the thing that you have is that you have opportunities, and that those opportunities matter. And that was very clear insofar as I would travel, I could see that difference in opportunities. Now, this was a woman who lost 2 of the infants to whom she gave birth of 8. Her personal infant mortality rate was 25%. And she always wanted my dad to be a doctor, but he watched those 2 infants die, and he didn't want anything to do with healthcare. For me, though, I knew I was interested in people. I loved learning about people, and I loved science, and I thought that's how I wanted to serve. And it wasn't as much the work of being a doctor, but it was the work and the outcomes of medicine that I thought could dignify the set of opportunities that my grandmother pointed out every time I'd see her. Because I told you I could travel 10 years difference in life expectancy in 15 hours. I could travel 15 minutes into any neighborhood in Detroit and travel the same 10-year life expectancy gap. And so I went to be a doctor to do something about that. And then as I started my training in medicine, I came to appreciate that actually, unfortunately, the way that we organize our healthcare system in America is more a part of the problem than it is a part of the solution. And so I left clinical medicine and spent some time in academia where I really enjoyed my research. I thought that it was really important, except for I couldn't see what was going to come on the back end of all that research. And I was writing more and more papers with a fundamental premise that social determinants of health matter, and that we should be paying attention to them with respect to our public policy, but didn't see anything coming on the back end, publishing in esoteric journals that nobody would read unless they already kind of agreed with that premise. So one thing led to another, and I got the opportunity to come home to Detroit. I was in New York at the time, to rebuild the health department. Now, for folks who don't know the history of the Detroit Health Department, 185-year-old health department that was shut down when the city was facing bankruptcy and state takeover. You know, we have a whole conversation about defunding the police. What Detroit did, in effect, was defund public health. And my job in 2015 was to rebuild that health department. We had a $1 million city budget. Put that in perspective, New York was spending $150 per person per year on public health, and we were spending $150. Had 5 employees in the back of the building where people pay parking tickets, and then another 89 consultants who were hired in through an outside agency to fulfill the basic things that a health department has to do: vaccinations, lead, follow-up, et cetera. And my job was to rebuild that department, and we got to work. Took on some of the biggest polluters in the state of Michigan, made sure that our kids weren't drinking leaded water in their schools, had every school daycare and Head Start tested for lead in the water, made sure that every kid had a pair of glasses delivered at school within 2 weeks of a vision test. But ultimately came to realize that so much of the politics that were framing what we could and could not do were politics that paid less attention to the people that I thought really needed to be brought to the fore, and a lot more attention, unfortunately, to the corporations who tend to call shots in communities all over our country. And for that reason, felt like I needed to leave my role and run for office. I had just watched Flint get poisoned by the same system of politics that had shut down our health department. Really frustrated by the fact that there was no movement on things like water shutoffs. I couldn't move the city on them. Things like no movement on things like rethinking the approach that we were taking to demolitions to make it safer. And so, launched this outsider campaign. As you all well know, I did not win, but was able to frame a lot of the debate around the issues that I thought really mattered and bring them to the fore. And also, we built out a really strong policy framework that helped articulate how our state could move to single-payer healthcare, how we could offer free college for tuition-free and debt-free public college for every Michigander, how we could create publicly funded, subsidized Wi-Fi, really take on a state-level version of a Green New Deal, And since I've been sort of pushing those ideas out in different fora as a podcast host and as an author and as an educator and a speaker. And so that is sort of where my path has led me now, and a long wind up answer to get at, you know, why moms matter and why grandmas matter. And I'm really grateful for mine and so many of the others who are inspiring so many young people every day.
Well, you know, I'm really appreciative of your grandmother setting a context that, as you describe it, I see you pursuing more and more knowledge about how to understand the world. And you do have now a specialized view on this moment that we're experiencing. It's a very different view than mine, which, you know, is more experiential in some ways. And I wonder, are there things about this current pandemic and the current response that you think that we ought to be thinking about as citizens at this moment?
Yeah, unfortunately, when we think about our health, it's too easy to think about every individual's experience of health. And the thing about that is that it leaves us missing so much of what causes global or population level health challenges. And, you know, we know about pre-existing conditions, right? It was well known early on that people with pre-existing conditions were going to suffer worse courses and a higher likelihood of death if they were to contract COVID-19. But we as a society have been facing pre-existing conditions too. And the pre-existing conditions that I believe we were struggling with are pandemics as well, but they're chronic. They are less quickly moving, so we pay less attention to them. And now, you know, the framework I want you to appreciate this in is to think about the fact that, you know, as an epidemiologist, when you think about an infectious disease pandemic, you're taught to think about the nature of the pathogen, sure, but also the nature of the host and the nature of the environment. And our environment has been beating up on a particular group of hosts for a very long time through systemic racism. Now, before we ever had a COVID-19 pandemic, you know, David Satcher, who is the former Surgeon General under President Bill Clinton, did a very simple study. He just asked a simple question. How many lives would we save every year if we were able to reduce the mortality rate among Black Americans so that it was just the same as among white Americans? And he estimated that we would save 83,000 lives a year. Systemic racism has been an issue in this country for 401 years. Now you take that and you think about the fact that we're just now having a conversation about the simple argument that Black lives matter. What we're saying is those 83,000 lives ought not to be lost every single year. Now, that is one pandemic, right? Then there's a deeper pandemic even beyond that of insecurity in our country. And what I mean by that is, as I talked about in my book, this notion that I think we are struggling from a collective insecurity, a fear and anxiety for our future that is framed in the experience of loss over the past 40 years, as we have succumbed to the consequences of a governing consensus that tells us that the best way to provide ourselves with the basic means of a dignified life is to ask some large corporation, collective of corporations, to provide those things. And what that leads to is exclusion of the poorest and extraction from everyone else. And that has left us bereft of some basic things. You look at the healthcare system, you look at the housing system, you look at the infrastructure system, you look at the education system, you look at the voting system itself, our very democracy. And you see the same pattern of industrial privatization to the exclusion or extraction of too many people. And that experience has left us open to demagoguery, has left us open to the kind of divisiveness that we're seeing from federal leadership right now. And so those two things, that epidemic of insecurity, that pandemic of systemic racism, they were the pre-existing conditions that created the means into which this coronavirus hit. Now, I hope that as we think about where we go from here, we don't just focus on the pathophysiology of a virus underneath our skin, but we focus also on the pathophysiology in our society that happens above the skin. That explains why it is that 2.5 to 3 times as many Black and brown Americans are getting and dying of this disease, why the loss of livelihoods is disproportionately impacting Black and brown Americans, why so few are willing to actually just engage in very basic public health practices, why we're so open to demagoguery from a president who is politicizing this pandemic, and how we need to make sure that when we say never again, we're serious about it, right? Because the next pandemic, I mean, it was 100 years from the last one, but make no mistake, with climate change, the possibility for the next pandemic is a lot sooner than 100 years, and the possibility for a serious catastrophe like a climate event is extremely real. They're accelerating every single year, and so we have to see this virus as not just something that befell us, but rather a catalyst for what we were experiencing as a society even before then.
You know, I'm really appreciative of that perspective, and I don't know if you've seen Arundhati Roy's newest book, but she talks about this virus as a portal, moving us from one time into another, and one of the things she says is we need to think about what we want to take from the past and carry it on into the future. And I wonder, as you think about these young people listening to us today, what role do you see them able to play in not repeating some of these errors? What do you see from them?
I'll be honest, right? A lot of people ask me, you know, what gives me hope right now, and it's the fact that these young people recognize that the old way wasn't working. I mean, I'm about to turn 36 in 9 days, and that'll make me closer to 50 than I am to 20. And so I'm sort of in this odd position where I'm youngish, but I'm not quite young. And even in my generation, right, I was a junior in high school watching 9/11 happen in real time that kicked off wars that we're still fighting. I graduated college into the worst financial crisis in US history since the Great Depression. And I am trying to raise a toddler alongside my wife in the middle of a pandemic, right? And a financial downturn that is awful. And, you know, we are extremely privileged, all things considered. But at the same time, my generation is experiencing this. Now, I look at like young folks born at the turn of the century, and their experience has been that when they were 2, right, wars kicked off that has happened their whole lives, that when they were 7, 8, 9, 10, they watched their families go through this worst financial crisis in modern US history, possibly watch their parents lose their house and struggle to now pay for something as simple as a college education. They are really worried about the fact that they're now going to college in the middle of a pandemic, right? And you've got all these universities shutting down and trying to keep it going so that they can keep getting that tuition money. Like this is the circumstance in which young people are being raised, and they have had enough. And so, you know, their frustration with this moment and the future is founded in their social experiences of what this moment has created, and they've had enough. So like, I'm not worried about the young folks. I'm worried that those of us who are, you know, closer to 50 than we are to 20 are going to be a part of the solution for these young folks, rather than trying to hold on to a politics that does not answer to the challenges that we face today. And so it is on us to deliver and also to engage with young folks who see very clearly where we need to go and how we need to get there to build a future that is better for their children than the past has been to them.
You know, I'm now closer to 80 than to 50. So I'm thinking about this question of time and what are the things we need to do now to rebuild this kind of consensus around public health? For that matter, you know, you are a man of, among other things, of science. And what's your perspective on our ability to restore a sense of a public health mission? What are the things we need to do to move in that direction?
Yeah, I'll say 3 things. One is that in order for us to get back to a reason-based argument, we've got to learn how to speak truth to pain. I mean, a lot of us are real good at speaking truth to power. But one of the things I learned most in med school was the ability to listen to someone in pain and to reason with them while empathizing with their pain, realizing that their pain didn't give them a monopoly on truth. And I think what we have right now is a setting where the nature of our public conversation has been so hijacked by the, frankly, oftentimes acting out of pain. And nobody's done this better than the President of the United States, right? How often have you seen him weaponize this concept of it's unfair, right? He said it today about the fact that he was going to get muted, and his opponent's going to get muted. I mean, it's a completely fair setup. Everybody's getting muted, right? Like, but he's so unfair. And frankly, at some point, like, to me, I'm just like, Habibi, what about your life is unfair, right? You literally inherited everything, squandered it, somehow became a reality TV show star, and then became president of the United States. How is this unfair, right? It's unfair to a lot of the people on whose backs you climbed to get there, but it's not unfair to you. But this is the system of our public conversation. It is about playing out this notion of pain. And I just think that we're going to need to be able to get back to a public conversation that is focused on reason and truth. And part of the problem here is just the nature of our public conversation is so driven by social media that rewards the acting out of pain. And also, the nature of social media is that it is the entire enterprise is about addicting you to sell you stuff. And so it is going to give you the bait rather than the truth. And we've got to regulate social media so that it's not so baited, but also but it's also about being able to ask ourselves what is a real public conversation that is rooted in a collective that is true to our society, because right now we're not doing it. We're getting more and more segregated, whether that be physically, demographically, intellectually, and that's hurting us. So that's the second point, right? Is beyond being able to get past a narrative that is so driven by pain to one that's driven by truth, to be able to reintegrate our society so that we are sharing relationships even where we disagree. And I tell folks all the time, I'm like, look, you want to do something about the polarization in our society? Go spend time, purposely spend time with people who are not in your demographic. If you're college educated, how many times do you spend time with folks who are not college educated, right? If you are a person of color, how are you engaging with folks outside of these communities? If you are a white person, how often are you engaging in communities of color? How often are you engaging with people who occupy a different socioeconomic position than you, and sharing a real conversation with them about the things you care about? I mean, that's the reason why I love the fact that we started with the conversation about moms, because everybody's got a mom, and most everyone likes their mom, right? And so that's something that's just like, look, you can't be that bad if you love your mom, right? And so how do we start from there and be able to have a conversation rooted in a relationship about the things with which we disagree? Now, part of that has to mean that we're able to stand in the relationship, disagree deeply with someone, but be able to finesse a conversation. And I think we're so focused right now on winning the argument rather than winning the future, that we'd rather win the argument, right, and shut down that person and cancel them out. Well, that's not going to make for a society where we're actually collectively coming together and making decisions about truth, because we've just decided that this other person doesn't exist, right? And they're dead to me. The last thing I'll say is that we in the sciences have to take seriously our responsibility to communicate science to people, right? And there is something about academic culture that I really hope we can come together around and address. It's that, we luxuriate, to use a big word, right, in using language that is necessarily exclusive, right? And we like to be exclusive about our ideas. And the problem with exclusive ideas is that they exclude. And part of the job of scientists isn't just to do the science, but it's to communicate the science to the public and demonstrate why this is something for everybody, right? So I want more, I want small words and big ideas rather than small ideas and big words. And I really hope that we can get there.
Well, thank you for that. I've asked everybody else if there's a particular role that they think social workers could play in moving us toward this kind of speaking truth to pain, listening more, what you might see not only as a role for social workers, but also I'm thinking about if there are areas of public research that you think need to happen that haven't been happening.
So I actually think that social workers are such a critical bulwark in doing this, because you all spend a lot of your days, right, listening to pain and speaking truth to pain, and facilitating, right, walking folks through bureaucracies that unfortunately aren't built around them. They're usually built around the bureaucracy. And if there's a space where I would love social workers to lead us, it's helping us to think about how we design the systems that are supposed to benefit other people, so that they're designed around those people rather than they're designed around what makes the system the most comfortable. One of the things that we tried to do at the health department that I don't know if we succeeded to do was build a people-centered department. So rather than the bureaucracy thinking, orienting around itself and asking other people to orient their lives around it, that our bureaucracy would be oriented around people's lived experience. Now, that's really hard to do in a bureaucracy that is heavily underfunded like Detroit's. But there were things that we could do that really changed a conversation. Something as simple as food safety, right? To get a restaurant license, you had to know somebody who knew somebody to understand how the whole system worked. You had to get a okay from us. You had to get an okay from the building department. And if you're a low income restaurateur trying to open up a business, your access to a consultant who knows how the broken bureaucracy works may differentiate whether or not you ever get to open your business, right? And so we're systematically excluding certain groups of people simply because we have not organized around them, right? Similarly, why is it that a mother who might be working 2 jobs just to make ends meet has to go to a WIC clinic, a lead clinic, and then a different clinic for a vaccination clinic, when we could just turn those all into one clinic, right? It's a one-stop shop, right? Those simple solutions. And I think social workers oftentimes, I think about the social workers I worked with at the health department or in the hospitals. A lot of what you all end up having to do is like walk people through this broken bureaucracy, right? And one of the places where I do think that that social work can make a deep intervention is in asking or pushing bureaucracies to work around the people who are struggling in the system that we create, right? And then the other point is also this. I forgot who said this, but they said a systems for the poor or programs for the poor are a recipe for poor programs. And we've got to start collectivizing our programs, right? When everybody is invested in a program, it works better for everyone because everyone's invested. But the problem with a lot of our programs that are meant to be quote unquote safety net programs is that they are disinvested in because, of course, a whole side of our electorate is interested in pulling the rug from under poor people. And so we've got to start demanding, right, that we are invested in collective programs that offer collective benefits for everybody, so that no matter if you're poor or you're rich, right, the program is for you. And there's an investment in our public. The last, I had one last idea I wanted to share, and I forgot to get to in the last question that you asked. But there's a conversation that we need to be having about who the public is in our country, because for a long time, right, fundamentally, Black people have just been excluded from the concept of the public, right? And what do I mean by that, right? You think about the Derek Chauvin, the officer who put his neck on George Floyd's, his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That officer had sworn to protect the public safety. Not only did he not see George Floyd as a member of the public, he saw George Floyd as something from which he was supposed to protect the public, which implies, right, that a Black man like him is not part of the public. And it's not just public safety, right? Think about public health. When we hit 100,000 deaths in this country, 13,000 of those deaths were excess deaths to Black people, right? So they represented the difference in excess death to Black people, 13,000, 13% of those 100,000 deaths, right? So are we including Black people in public health? And then think about public education. We still fund public schools based on redlining, right? So 80 years ago, when the Federal Housing Administration systematically discriminated against Black people and redlined them in certain communities and would not invest in loans in those communities or in those homes, right? What that meant is that the government literally invested in white neighborhoods and did not invest in Black neighborhoods. And now when we fund public education based on property taxes, which is of course a function of the compounding of that government investment, right? And then we ask schools to be an engine of social mobility. Well, all they really are is they're an engine, right, of social regression, because all we've done is disinvested, right, or not failed to undo the system, right, by which we had systematically cut down access to basic resources for Black people, and we continue to do it by creating this system of in effect implicit discrimination against Black schooling. And so, you know, Black kids are not included in public education either, right? Public utilities, go to Flint, right? Black folks aren't included in the public utilities. So you got public safety, public health, public education, public utilities, right? And throughout it all, we are systematically failing to include. And I think one of the places where I would love to see social workers think is connecting public policy to the lived experience of people who you engage with. What does it mean for someone to be actively, implicitly excluded from the public, right? When we build public programs, right? Or we're talking about public officials, right? All of these spaces, you see a systematic exclusion, and that active engagement, this force to include, I think social workers are well poised to be at the vanguard of.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's really critical for us to think about, from whatever position we occupy, how we can now expand what people think of not only as the public, but what realities they see. And that's, of course, what Tawana's doing. That's what Teddy's doing. That's what you're doing. And I want to give us a few minutes among the three of you. Are there questions that have emerged or things that you've heard that you want to emphasize? And I want to give us a second to talk with each other. It's been, for me, a really rich and thoughtful conversation. And I want to uplift some of the really insightful things that we've heard. And I want to also encourage everybody in the chats to, if you have a question, to write that down. And we'll take a few minutes to pull those in as well. But Teddy, Tawana, or Abdul, is there something you want to raise with each other?
I just want to thank Teddy and Dr. El Saeed. You know, like I said, I enter every space really wanting to learn more. I enter every space knowing I don't know everything. And it's really just been another opportunity to think more deeply about accessibility, inaccessibility, exclusion, and, you know, how much more work we have to do to care for one another. And so, yeah, I'm just deeply grateful for the contributions today, and yours as well, Shay. And I, you know, onward and upward. We have much to do, but we have been doing much as well. And so how do we care for one another and create a society that doesn't extract so much from all of us, and that creates a more accessible, more humane world for us to exist and thrive in?
Teddy, is there anything you want to lift up or emphasize, or is there a question that's occurred to you as you listen to the other panelists?
Wow, really, honestly, both of you, what you have said is just spot on. I've been nodding my head the whole time. I am in 100% agreement. We do need to prioritize people in everything that we do, and to make sure that our community is very healthy, because we are human, and we do need to have that similar equality. So yeah, definitely.
I did want to ask a question to my colleagues. As you think about what you want in public officials, and in reflected in our public service, where do you see the greatest need for change, and what would that look like to you all?
Ooh. You know, I will say I'm having a, you know, if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I was totally like the naysayer. I was like, you know, no, I'm not messing with public officials, you know, they're on that side and I'm on this side, right? But the last several years have really taught me a great deal about the potential for every human to be transformed, and additional information and access to information is one of the great transformers, right? And so right now we're working on a Detroiters Bill of Rights as an example, and we're working with 2 council members who are now part of helping us to shape policy that they at one point were, you know, voting on the other side, right? Use face recognition and mass surveillance as an example. And so I'm really learning that coming to the table, providing as much information as possible does afford us an opportunity to open up some doors that were closed. Now, not everybody's going to come to your side, but we do owe it to each other to listen and to hear each other out and to not be defensive when possible, because we've all been miseducated. And so I think my greatest ask of public officials is to not see activists, quote unquote activists, as the other side, and to offer up an opportunity to hear new information and to make critical decisions based on that new information. And so the more that I've opened up to hear, the more that I'm seeing others open up to hear. And so, you know, and I'll just finally say this, you know, Detroiters want to be seen and not watched. And so I'm asking for public officials to see Detroiters and not surveil each Detroiters, and start to respond in more humane ways.
Betty, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I would like to add to that, and including that Detroit Bill of Rights are, in Detroit, we need to be involved with that campaign, and the woman who is leading that, and making sure that we continue to educate the public about what is going on right now. And the #1 challenge is our deaf community. They've missed that information. They've missed those opportunities to be able to be involved with the fight to make sure that our rights are equal. So we need to do our part in the education of our neighbors, of our friends, and to make sure that they are aware of different policy change that really impacts us. So we need to take some responsibility and making sure that we are educating our community about this important issue.
Thank you. You know, I'm thinking about so many of the people watching probably are new to the idea of activism. And if I were thinking about how to get started, what would be a suggestion as a first step for someone who's never put a lawn sign up, never been to a demonstration? What do they need to move forward to become active?
I'm partial here. I'm going to lift up Grace, and something that you say all the time, Shay, is sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. And the first step is to ask the questions. If we're closed off and we're not willing to deepen the questions, then, you know, how can you move forward? It's you know, it's not easy to get active. When you get active, your eyes open to more and more disparities in the world. And that means that, you know, the saying ignorance is bliss is really a true saying. And I didn't know that on a real level until I became active in social justice. And there are many days where I was like, oh, I wish I didn't know what I know. But the only way to change the society and create the world we all deserve is to deepen the questions. And so, yeah, that's my first advice. Like, first step, ask questions, think deeper.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I would just add that the best leaders are people who know when and how to follow. And if you can find leaders that you believe in, and you can engage with them in a productive way, and engage with the movement, and then while you're there, seek to, as Tawana mentioned, deepen the questions and talk to folks and listen. I think those are the most important things, right? I mean, if you can really build that capacity to listen deeply to people, not just for what they say, but for why they say it, and to understand what is driving that conversation, I think is really important. The other point is also to remember that so much of what an activist does is tries to engage for and funnel the speech of people who don't have the privilege, the time, the space to speak. And you can't do that well unless you've truly taken the time to listen and to understand and to seek people out where they are, right? There are a lot of folks for whom, you are trying to agitate and engage, who by the very nature of the reasons why you're agitating and engaging, right? They're working 2 or 3 jobs, they're underserved, they've got, so many things they've got to take on, are not there. And I think one has to be curious about who you're not hearing from, right? Who are the voices and what are the voices and what are the experiences that you cannot hear? And I think deep listening is listening not just for what people are saying, but for what they're not saying and who's not saying it. And I think being able to cultivate that taste for what is being said and what the conversation is being led by, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, for this conversation, our audience has been listening a lot, and I wonder, are there a couple of questions that you want to raise from the chats? I've only been able to see it going by, but we do have a chat monitor.
Yes, I'm here. Shay, there are just a few questions that were posed in the chat. One is around research, researching these issues. The participant asks, how can we advocate for a thoughtful data collection that does not stigmatize or put people at risk for research fatigue?
Thoughtful data collection that doesn't put people at risk. I know, Tawana, you work on it.
I was just getting ready to pull up a resource. So I co-authored a toolkit that I just dropped in there. I think it's on the resource list as well. And it is with the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy Initiative. And it is on centering racial equity throughout data integration. And it, because many of us who collect data, whether for whatever reason, through our organizations, will be integrating it in some way, shape, or form. And if racial equity is not centered, then we will replicate the harms that Dr. El Saeed was talking about. And so whether that's the medical industry, whether that's social work, whether that's in organizations that you are working in, we have an opportunity, a greater opportunity than we've ever had to center racial equity. And so this toolkit is very powerful. I happen to know that there are a lot of organizations within the city who are already starting to implement it, as well as other countries. And so, yeah, definitely take a look at it, reach out if you have questions. The Actionable Institute for Social Policy is open to try and offer some technical support. But yeah, take that toolkit. It's a few dozen pages and it'll keep you busy.
Anybody else want to talk about data? Or yeah, go Teddy.
Data, yes, data.
Or research.
Can you clarify the question a little more so I can?
The question is how do people do research that doesn't create more harm? How do we make sure that the research is in the service of people, if that's a fair interpretation of it?
Really, how to make sure that our data is serving the people is to make sure that what we are doing and that data that we are collecting is going to support the facts of what we need to push for in terms of change. For example, with right now, our community has already said, we don't see any concerns or we don't see any problems of people with the disabled community that are here. Why? Because not many of us are filing complaints, notifying the city, or notifying them that there's not enough accessibility. So we need more of that kind of data that not only impacts people with disabilities, but for Black people as well. I have 160,000 people that, you know, that are living here in Detroit, that pretty much that's good data in itself, but a high number of that are people with disabilities. So we need to continue to do that work and collect that data to support people with disabilities in effective equality. And that's what we need, because a lot of people are not in legislative power, and they need that kind of data to support and verify as to why they need to approve specific bills and laws, and getting those passed to advocate. We have to make sure that we have enough resources for those people with disabilities, especially with the current pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement.
You know, I want to lift up the We the People and the People's Research Collective, because they've done an interesting use of data, among other things, collecting the relationship between water shutoffs and public demonstrations. And they document that every time there have been massive public outcry about water shutoffs, the water shutoffs have gone way down. And that's an interesting and important thing for us to know, that public advocacy works. So I think it's not only the question of how do we collect data, but what are the questions we're pursuing in order to get the data that we get. And that a lot of times those questions are not the questions, as Dr. Al says, from the academy. Those are the questions that are emerging from people who are engaging in struggles for justice. Do we have one more question, I think?
Yes, just one more question. In addition to the Detroit Bill of Rights and the Detroit Disability Office, what are specific policies that we should be paying attention to and advocating?
Specific policies that we could be paying attention to, along with the Bill of Rights and the Office for Disability Justice.
I'll jump in on just a couple. Number one, I think that, as what everyone well knows, and if you have not voted yet, please do. We have this very, very, very big election coming up on November 3rd. And I know everybody's already requested their absentee ballot and dropped it off, or is getting ready to vote. And you can go to iwillvote.com or votesaveamerica.com to make a plan. There is going to be, if there is a change in administration, the next 2 years will likely set a lot of the framework public policy around everything from healthcare to climate change to criminal legal system reform at the federal level. And I think that in that discussion, we need voices from the ground in communities like Detroit, all over the country, to be shaping that debate. And so, you know, that is going to be a really, really, really important conversation. I think that I really want folks to be paying attention to, because what tends to happen is, you know, if there is a change in administration, it will also potentially come with a change in the Senate, which means that you'll have aligned President, Senate, House, and those tend to be those 2 years where major legislation happens. And so I really want folks to be paying attention to what's happening on their key issues at the federal level, because I do think that the implications for communities like Detroit are going to be critical. And a couple of places where there really is going to be a lot of movement is rethinking the economy around both climate change and healthcare, and the kind of jobs that will be coming forward out of that. And then also, I think criminal legal system reform is going to be something that really is top of mind. So these are places where I hope folks will pay attention.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We are going to pick up on how you started that last question, this question of voting. And we have a representative here. Dean, I think I'm going to turn this back over to you. But before I do that, I want to really thank everyone for your comments and your thinking. And if I can pull from the chat, people would really like to see this sort of thing happen more and again. So thank you for what you've brought to us and how you've helped us really think about the magnitude of what we are all facing, not just through an election, but really now for the next 20 or 30 years, we're making choices that will influence our children, our grandchildren, and their children. So with that, Dean Cheryl, are you ready to come back in and introduce our final moments?
I am, and I just do want to say that I'm so thankful and grateful and admire each and every one of our panelists. And I feel very strongly that universities need to be community resources. And I am so proud of the activist history that the School of Social Work has had, and I want to revive it and grow it. And that's why I wanted all of you here. And that's why this has just been, I think, a wonderful presentation for our students. So I look forward to the future and involving all of you in future discussions. But before we end, I want to bring on Andre. Are you still with us? Andre is our head of all of our social work educations and pulling together social work votes. So I want you to have the last word here so that everyone is on the same page.
Lots to follow here, and thank you so much to all our panelists. This was a really powerful and inspiring conversation, and I feel like I've learned a lot. I feel very lucky to be wrapping up here and talking about what is really an opportunity for us as a profession and as advocates to make our voices heard. That's obviously the super important election coming up. When we started Social Work Votes at the beginning of August, it was really about how we can build a culture of voting within Wayne State School of Social Work and how we can get our students that are currently registered, that are needing to file absentee, and that are in classes to get them out into the electoral process, even within their own student communities. So myself, my beautiful mentor Judith Weinman, and so many of the faculty put together the Social Work Votes campaign. And we came up with a 3-part plan to get out the vote in the School of Social Work.
Oh, is it different for everybody?
Yeah, it is different, but that's probably Sasante. He's hiding behind the PATH program's logo.
Yeah. Hello. Oh, okay. I got to turn it the other way.
Thank you. So, thanks. Anyways, so we had a 3-part plan here. Our first part, we on September 26th had our campaign school, our fall 2020 campaign school on Zoom, protecting the right to vote. Very blessed to have Tanya Rhodes Smith. She's an amazing social worker from the University of Connecticut and the Nancy Humphrey Institute, and she talked about voter suppression, how false narratives around illegal voting and voter fraud kind of contribute to a really toxic voting climate, and how voting within macro social work and advocacy in general is an intervention, a community-based intervention. So that was a really great seminar we had on September 26th. We'll be sending out the video of that event soon on YouTube and an email. So if you're interested in kind of hearing that seminar, stay tuned. Our big outreach project for students and volunteers was our Rolling Vote Initiative, or the RVI. I compiled a team of student volunteers, graduate students, faculty, and practicing social workers to go ahead and tackle the big, hairy, audacious goal of calling all 1,000 registered social work students, calling our entire student body to make sure that they were registered, had their absentee ballots, and knew how they were going to vote. And there was kind of 2 intentions behind this phone banking project, beyond just getting out the vote and making sure that every one of our students was participating in the electoral process. It was also about building practitioner skills for our students and giving social work students the opportunity to see that their profession can be rooted in things like cold calling and electoral tasks such as phone banking. So really to give students a hands-on learning opportunity this election season. So the question remains, what are we going to do on election day? Social Work Votes has built such an awesome momentum in building this conversation within our school and building the Wayne State's urban mission. I'm proud to announce we're going to have our election day call to action. We are going to be recalling all 1,000 School of Social Work students all day, kind of in a telethon-esque on election day. We're going to be doing reminder calls, making sure that everybody stays fired up about the vote, that everybody votes that day, that we are together in a positive healing sense, because really this November is an opportunity for us as social workers, for us as advocates, for us as Detroiters, for us as Michiganders. This is an opportunity for us as Americans to have our voices heard, to tell the people at the top the things that we want, and to build a more just future. All of the panelists here fight for justice in their own way and in their own platform. So beyond the vote, I encourage everybody here to engage with those organizations, follow the links in the chat, find the cause that is calling to you, and after November 3rd, get out there and keep that momentum going. Keep the fire in your spirit still alive so that we can push forward together after November 3rd. But before then, go ahead and check out our Social Work Votes page at the Wayne State School of Social Work website. I'll go ahead and post that link right quick. I will also post my email. I'm looking for volunteers on election day. We're looking for people to make phone calls between now and election day. And so, and I am always looking for opportunities to speak with fellow advocates about ways that I personally can get involved. So that's my email. Drop me a line if you'd like to get to know me. My name is Andre Adipolo. I'm a community organizer and a consultant from Livonia, Michigan. I'm a proud graduate of the Wayne State School of Social Work for both my master's degree and my undergraduate degree. And I am very happy to be here. And thanks everybody for the time. Let's get out the vote November 3rd and let's make it happen, okay?
Thank you so much, Andre, and for all of the leadership you've provided in the school and to the student organizations. I want to thank Judith Weinman for leading the student orgs, Sarah Gleicher for working behind the scenes to make this happen, Betsy Vanderstelt and Praveen Thomas from the school for helping us get this on. I have enjoyed being here and have learned a great deal. And I look forward to the future of Wayne State University School of Social Work students creating social change. But thank you all. Have a good night and please be safe.
Go vote.